This is the legendary prisoner of war camp Stalag Luft III. Built to be escape-proof, it was also the place where 76 Allied servicemen escaped. This legendary breakout became known as the Great Escape. In this film, we'll break down what made Stalag Luft III virtually escape-proof and the ingenious planning and engineering that went into pulling off a truly remarkable escape, albeit one that ended in tragedy. By 1942, Nazi forces were becoming increasingly frustrated. They'd captured thousands of Allied airmen shot down during raids over Europe, but many of them escaped. Most were rounded up at huge cost to the Germans. To counter this, the Nazis decided to build a series of escape-proof camps. Stalag Luft III was one of the so-called unbreakable camps. The camp was split into 5 sections: the west, east, south, center, and north compounds. In the center was the guard station, placed so that the personnel could keep an eye on all 5 parts at the same time. The huts were sturdy structures made of pine and fir trees from the surrounding forest and set on brick foundations. This measure aimed to prevent prisoners from hiding tunnel entrances. In each compound, there were around 16 huts. The North Camp, where the escape began, had 15 single-story wooden huts arranged in a systematic layout of 3 rows with 5 huts in each row. Each hut was divided into 16 rooms, each with dimensions of approximately 10 by 12 feet. Initially, rooms accommodated 2 to 4 men, but due to increasing numbers, they became significantly more crowded. In addition to the standard rooms, there were 3 sets of private quarters, likely for reserved officers. Each hut was placed at least 120 feet from a warning wire, which was fastened to wooden posts around 2.5 foot high. These extended all the way around the camp's edge. The North Camp's perimeter was roughly 5 miles, and it's estimated that warning wire posts were placed every couple of feet or so, meaning there were around 13,300 posts in that compound alone. The wire was hard to miss. If a prisoner did get past that wire, they'd meet a 10-foot-high barbed wire fence 25 feet beyond. 5 feet beyond that was another 10-foot-high barbed wire fence, and between those fences was a mangled concertina of sharp, coiled wire. Crawling or climbing over that would be difficult. In addition, there were watchtowers, erected in 150 feet intervals along the fences. They were known to the prisoners as goon towers. Each had a machine gun, a spotlight, and a guard at all times. The guard had shoot-to-kill orders for anyone who crossed the warning wire. Escape above ground was almost impossible, but that did not stop the prisoners from trying. Unfortunately, none were successful. But if you couldn't escape above ground, then maybe you could escape below it. The Stalag Luft III camp was at the base of a long, shallow slope where geological strata were deposited by glaciers in the last ice age, creating a feature known as podzol. On the surface of the podzol is a thin layer of grey soil, rich in organic matter. Underneath this is a thick layer of sand that's bright and mostly yellow, but occasionally red thanks to iron staining. The brightness of the sand meant it was difficult to dig a tunnel and dispose of the earth above ground without the grey surface revealing the conspiracy. The terrain was also soft enough for the Germans to bury a ring of seismographic microphones to detect any digging below the camp fences. We don't know how many were buried, but there were enough that the Germans were confident that no one would risk a below-ground escape attempt. Even so, while the camp was operational, the Germans did catch prisoners trying to build tunnels more than 80 times. So the guards, or ferrets as the prisoners called them, would search the huts twice a day at roll call, as well as at other random times. These searches may include counting the number of bedboards. Oddly, the Germans recorded a high rate of bedboard loss, along with similarly suspicious loss of other items of furniture. They simply resupplied the camp, in effect the Germans were unwittingly aiding the escapees. If a prisoner did manage to get past the fences and evade capture by a ferret, the next obstacle was the thick pine forest surrounding the camp. Beyond that was a series of well-patrolled roads, all leading to Sagan. If an escapee managed to reach the nearby village undetected, many of the camp's guards happened to be stationed there. Any prisoner would stick out like a sore thumb. The camp was about as far away from a neutral country as you could get at the time. To reach freedom, a fugitive would have to travel either 250 miles to Sweden or 400 miles to the Swiss border across the German Reich, a difficult thing to do if you didn't speak fluent German. The camp was to all intents and purposes escape-proof. In October 1942, squadron leader Roger Bushell was captured and taken to Stalag Luft III. When he arrived, escape was very much an individual endeavor. It was each man for himself. Bushell knew that if men were going to get out, they had to be more organized and coordinated. He set up a committee known as the X Organization. Bushell was the big X, the man at the top. Beneath him were little X's, each of whom had a particular skill or trade. Each was put in charge of a section. Some leaned into skills they had acquired during the years of conflict, like intelligence gathering and security. Others used skills that they had from before the war, ranging from tool and map making to engineering, tunnel design, document forgery, and clothing production. The key to Bushell's plan were two little X's, Polish airmen, Bronislaw Mickiewicz and Zbigniew Kustrinski. Before the war, they had worked as master builders. They were the sort of men who could build a tunnel strong enough for a mass escape, but one that was secret enough to remain unknown to the German guards. The plan was not to dig one tunnel, but three. If the guards found one route, then they could continue work on the other tunnels. If they found two, they'd be truly convinced that they'd ruined all of the prisoners' plans. The three tunnels became known as Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom led from Hut 123, the most southeasterly hut in the North Camp, and headed west. The entrance was a hole in the hut's cement floor, right at the bottom of the chimney, where it met the washroom. This was the perfect spot because the concrete support for the stove and the chimney made it hard for the guards to see what was going on underneath the hut. The prisoners used cement to cast a door that fit perfectly in the hole, then filled any gaps around the edges with clay. To make sure it was even harder to detect, they threw dust over the hatch and placed bins on top. Dick was right in the hut next to Tom, and like Tom, it traveled west. As it began further out than Tom, the prisoners thought it was the least likely to be discovered. For the entrance to Dick, they used a blind spot created by the drainage system. The hut washrooms each had a flat concrete floor that sloped inwards from a water collection rim to a sump built from red brick and concrete. On top of the sump was a grate. 3 terracotta pipes came out of the sump, 2 leading to a water tank and another to a water collection point outside the hut. To access the tunnel, the prisoners had to go through the floor of the washroom and remove a concrete slab from the bottom of the tank using metal hooks. This meant emptying the drainage tank. This was a quick job to a practiced hand, but it was a sticking point and caused Bushell some concern. To hide the entrance, all they had to do was put the grating back in place. Harry was built far away from the first 2 tunnels in Hut 104 to the north of the North Camp. For Harry's entrance, the prisoners used the concrete support for the stove as cover again, but this time they removed the tiles underneath the stove and glued them to a wooden board. They put the board back where the tiles had been, added hinges to one side, and placed wooden handles on the stove. To the stovepipe, they added an extension so that the entire assembly could be moved with ease, even with a fire still burning within. The sudden disappearance of smoke may have aroused the guards' suspicions. The entire access point could be opened or closed in less than 20 seconds. To cover the gaps, all they had to do was sweep some dust from the stove, and it became totally invisible. All 3 tunnels were built in roughly the same way. The hardest part of the dig was the beginning. Chipping through the concrete and brickwork took days. Once that was done, they dug downwards. Thanks to 2 German guards known as tame goons, whom the prisoners bribed with cigarettes and Red Cross food rations, the escape committee knew the depth of the microphones. To avoid sonic detection, each of the tunnels lay around 30 feet below ground. Once they reached that depth, the prisoners began to dig horizontally. The passageways were claustrophobic, just 24 inches wide. Worried that microphones might still catch them out, the men also used blankets as soundproofing, both at the entrances and along the walls and ceiling of the tunnels. By the entrances to the tunnels, there were small chambers to make and store tools, evacuate sand, and house an air pump. A necessary addition as the tunnels became longer and the natural airflow stagnated. This pump was made from parts of hockey sticks, ping-pong paddles, and knapsacks. The pump used a reciprocating wooden frame to compress one canvas airbag and then at the same time inflate another. The compressed bag delivered fresh air to the tunnel chamber, while the negative pressure in the second bag caused stale air to be sucked out of the tunnel. The standard design of the pump relied on an operator pushing and pulling an oar in a rowing motion. The air pipelines were made from over 1,400 powdered milk tins, held together by natural friction, with one tin pushed into the other, with the joins sealed for air tightness with greaseproof paper and resin. The prisoners made tools from whatever they could find. When escape day came, they had fashioned 34 chairs, 478 spoons, and 30 shovels into digging implements. If they needed something more specialist like a spade, they could then turn to their tame goons. To shore up the walls and ceilings, the prisoners used wooden boards taken from their beds. After digging for a couple of feet, they would lay the boards along the walls and then jam more boards into the ceiling before starting to dig again. According to guards interviewed later, more than 4,000 bedboards and 90 bunk bed frames were used to support the 3 tunnels. Then they had to install the all-important trolley system. It became increasingly clear that moving sand and other spoil by hand would be too time-consuming, so the prisoners laid rails made from wooden floorboards taken from underneath their beds. The trolley wheels were 2 discs sawn using the spring of a record player and glued together. The inner disc was larger and acted as a flange to prevent derailment. Linking the wheels were axles taken from sections of the barracks stoves, and the base of the trolley used to transport materials or prisoners came from the beech bedboards at the head of each bunk. The men hoped that all 3 tunnels would go 295 feet beyond the fence into the tree cover. The first almost to make it under the barbed wire was Tom. By September 1943, Tom was approximately 220 feet long and had reached beyond the fence line. But one of the guards spotted yellow sand in the camp grounds. This drove the Germans to increase their monitoring of the prisoners. At 5 a.m. on September the 8th, 1943, the prisoners of Hut 123 were woken for a random inspection, and a guard probing the floor almost fell through the tunnel entrance. The Germans took photos of the tunnel before blowing it up. But the 3-tunnel plan had worked, and after foiling another escape, the guards relaxed a little. Even so, Bushell wanted to be careful. As winter 1943 rolled in, work on the other 2 tunnels came to a halt. As the ground started to thaw, Bushell decided it was time to make the final push. They needed a new way to get rid of the sand. Even though the coldest months were over, there was still snow on the ground, making the bright yellow sand very obvious. At that point, Dick was just 60 feet long, whereas Harry had made better progress. Bushell decided that they should focus on Harry and backfill the more problematic Dick with Harry's sand. By early March 1944, Harry was nearly 368 feet long and had cleared the fence. It ran under the barbed wire to the north of the hut and beneath the camp's solitary confinement hut known as the cooler. Then it passed the main perimeter fence close to a goon tower. Once Harry was finally completed, it consisted of 4 distinct sections: the narrow entrance shaft, the workshop with its chambers, the main shaft, and the exit shaft. 2 compartments were built along the main shaft to serve as changing points. They were named Piccadilly Circus and Leicester Square. after the two neighbouring London underground stations. The prisoners decided it was time to build an exit hatch. They dug upwards, stopping roughly 2 feet from the surface on March the 14th. What they didn't know at the time was that they were actually 33 feet from the tree line at the edge of the camp. As escape day drew closer, activity in the camp ramped up. The prisoners responsible for forging papers got cameras from the tame goons and began photographing the escapees. The men working on clothing took uniforms, blankets, and anything else they could find to fashion garments approximating civilian clothes. RAF tunics became single-breasted jackets, pajamas became shirts, American military boots became respectable shoes. Not all of the 600 men who had worked on the tunnel could escape, so Bushell prioritized 60 who had a better chance of making it because they could speak German and had escape experience. Another 140 drew lots, while 20 who had drawn the short straw but were most deserving made up the final contingent. On March the 24th, Bushell decided it was time to go. There were a few reasons for this. There was no moon, making it harder for the tower guards to see any disturbance. Another bonus was that one of the most notorious German guards, Corporal Karl Greiser, or Rubberneck, wasn't on duty. A discipline officer from the escape committee, known as the Marshal, went around camp informing the escapees that it was time to go, and they gathered in Hut 104. There they received any additional papers and clothing, along with compasses, maps, and a ration of homemade fudge cake. The first man out of the tunnel was a marshal, who cut through the last layer of soil and installed a hatch. It was precisely then that their mistake had become clear, where they could see they were nowhere near the tree line. It was a rough fix, but the marshal took some rope to use as a signal and ran it from the exit to inside the tree line. Each man descended into the tunnel. There, they waited for a signal before climbing on the first trolley, lying face down. A marshal at the first station, known as Piccadilly Circus, then pulled them along. Then they transferred to another trolley and repeated the process to the Leicester Square area of the tunnel. Finally, they waited behind the end curtain of the tunnel until a further signal came to climb the ladder at the exit. Not everything ran smoothly. At around midnight, an air raid siren sounded and the guards plunged the camp into blackout. This slowed operations. Prisoners had to use mutton fat lamps until the lights were back on. At 2 a.m, the lights were on again, but there was another problem. Part of the tunnel had caved in, so the prisoners had to dig through the sand and clear the tracks. In spite of the setbacks, by 4:55 a.m, 76 of the 220 prisoners had managed to get out through Harry. At that point, their luck turned. A German guard who was patrolling beyond the fence strayed from his normal route and nearly fell into the exit hatch. The escape stopped immediately, and the Germans sounded the alarm. The 7 men in the tunnel had to turn around and go back to the hut, and 4 who were still in the woods were captured straight away. The guards acted swiftly, spreading out over the surrounding area and capturing almost everyone who made their way out of the tunnel. But some men slipped their grasp. Jens Müller, who had designed both the trolley system and the ventilation pump, and his fellow Norwegian airman Pete Bergsland, had left just after 2 a.m. as numbers 43 and 44 on the roster. They managed to get to Zegen and sneak over the tracks and a wooden bridge to the train station. Both men walked casually to the ticket office and bought tickets to Frankfurt and Der Oder. Before they were spotted, the train left the station. They reached Frankfurt before taking a connection to Stettin in Poland. There, they found some friendly Swedish sailors in a French brothel who smuggled them onto a ship bound for Gothenburg, Sweden. From there, they made it back to England. Hot on the Norwegians' heels was Bram van der Stok, a Dutch colleague. He had managed to convince a local that he was a Dutch worker who was out because he was terrified of the air raid sirens. The resident, taking pity, then helped van der Stok to the station without detection. From there, he travelled 100 miles to Breslau station, now known as Wrocław, to board a train to Dresden. He was a veteran escapee, having broken free and been recaptured 3 times before. After reaching Dresden, he continued on to Utrecht, where he met the Dutch resistance, who helped him to a Belgian safe house. Now, with Belgian citizenship, He trekked over the Pyrenees to neutral Spain, presented himself to the British consulate, and made it finally to England in July 1944. Despite the initial success, the Great Escape ended in brutal failure. The other 73 escapees did not make it. The German leadership were furious, and 50 men were ordered to be executed. Today, a plaque to the 50 stands close to the site where Stalag Luft III was located.